It was just another Sunday in Rockbridge, Maryland. Casserole in the oven, golf murmuring on the TV, and my parents debating curtain fabric like it was national policy. I was home from Quantico, pretending to be the dutiful daughter. Greg, my younger brother, held court at the head of the table, telling stories that made everyone laugh. I poured the wine. I smiled. I played my part, the quiet, practical one. Lena, the good one. They hadn't earned that version of me, but I gave it anyway. Greg wore success like a charm bracelet, loud and glinting. My mother laughed too hard at his jokes. My father called his instincts sharp, though Greg had been bailed out twice and fired once. I sat, spine straight, dress blues perfect, eating green beans off a chipped plate. I hadn't planned to wear the uniform, but I didn't take it off either. My father noticed. He raised an eyebrow, then smiled like he was in on some joke. "Well," he said, carving the roast, "look who still plays dress-up." My mother sighed. I didn't answer. Greg had always been the golden boy, startups, investments, charm that could melt steel. That night, he wore a navy blazer over an untucked shirt and acted like the living room was a press conference. "They're calling it an indictment," he said, shrugging. "But it's just noise, a clerical error, some Marine clerk poking around old procurement files. It'll blow over." He looked at me when he said, "Marine, deliberate, precise." My father chuckled, carving another slice of roast. "She probably wears that uniform to the grocery store." Laughter. My mother didn't look up from her plate. "She means well." They always said that about me. She means well. Not she's good at her job, not she's committed, just well-meaning, like a child who tidies up unasked. Greg leaned back, elbows wide. "Honestly, the charges are laughable. Misclassification, miscommunication. If they think encrypted tech can't be tracked to vendors through shell companies, that's their problem." I waited. "I mean," he continued, smiling, "who in the DOD is going to care about 6 missing modules from a dead-end logistics branch?" My fork moved silently through the vegetables on my plate. No one noticed. "I have the best legal team on the East Coast," he said. "One of them used to clerk for the appellate court. They're already drafting the motion to dismiss. Conflict of interest, procedural mishandling, the whole thing." He was talking fast now, louder than before. My father nodded as if the verdict had already been returned. "It's politics," Greg added. "They need to show teeth, and I'm a convenient target. That's all this is." The room agreed by default. No one questioned, no one pushed. Greg had been the family's success story for too long. His losses were always temporary, his flaws charming. I kept my posture relaxed. They didn't know. They didn't know about the case file labeled RAVENWATCH, or the months of surveillance, or the digital forensics team working from a locked sublevel 2 floors below mine. They didn't know the IP traces, the shell LLCs across 3 continents, or the procurement trails rerouted through military subcontractors who didn't exist on paper. They didn't know that the Marine clerk was a senior cyber operations analyst. They didn't know she was me. My clearance was deep enough to see into shadows most people didn't know existed. And in those shadows, my brother had sold access. It hadn't started big. A single firewall downgrade on a non-essential server, pushed through with fake credentials. A glitch in a network permissions audit. Then came the ports, the microprocessors, the closed bid contracts for parts that could only be used for secure communication hardware. It was subtle, deliberate, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. I knew where to look. I didn't tell them that, of course. I passed the wine. "You okay, Lena?" my mother asked softly, glancing over. I nodded once. "Fine." Greg poured himself another glass. "Just don't let them assign you to my case," he said with a smirk. "Wouldn't want things to get personal." He thought it was funny. The irony sat in my mouth like iron. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. He had no idea that RAVENWATCH was already being cited in classified legal briefings as a foundational case for cyber-based export control violations. No idea that the investigation had resulted in the shutdown of a tech corridor stretching from Seoul to Helsinki. No idea that a task force was built from it. No idea that the task force was mine. They didn't know I'd requested recusal, not because I couldn't handle it, because the outcome was already inevitable, and I didn't need my name on the paperwork to finish the job. But he had crossed a line that week, leaking sealed exhibits to a defense journalist, trying to reframe himself as a whistleblower. That was when I updated my affidavit. That was when the court called for a hearing. That was when the judge asked to meet the analyst. They didn't know. Not yet. At the table, Greg looked proud, smug, confident in the way only men who've never had to worry about consequences can be. "I mean," he said, waving his fork in my direction, "maybe Lena can fetch coffee for my attorneys when they win the motion. Always wanted to have a sister in support services." My father laughed. A full, unbothered laugh. My mother smiled behind her hand. I felt the silence in my throat before it reached the room. I didn't flinch. I didn't respond. I reached for the salt, passed it to Greg, and nodded like he'd said something normal. Let them laugh. Let them sigh. Let them believe I was still the girl who chose duty over drama, law over love. Let them believe I was the quiet one, the good one. Let them believe I had no teeth. For now. After dinner, we moved to the living room. My father poured drinks, scotch for him, bourbon for Greg, a splash of wine left in my mother's glass. I declined. I never drank on nights like this. Greg stood near the fireplace, holding his glass like a microphone. "You know what's funny?" he said, watching the ice swirl. "Every guy on my legal team used to be a prosecutor. One of them even worked cybercrime. It's like, what's the phrase? Poacher turned gamekeeper, or vice versa." He looked around the room, waiting for someone to bite. No one did. He turned to me. "You'd like them, Lena. Real smart. Sharp suits. Mostly Ivy League. Maybe I'll bring them to the trial so you can watch how professionals do things." My mother smiled faintly, like it was all just a performance. My father chuckled again. Greg raised his glass higher. "To Lena," he said, "the only one in the family who still thinks the government is good at anything." I stayed silent. "To Lena," he said louder, "who might just get to fetch coffee for the real lawyers when they win my case." He grinned at me, waiting. My father laughed first, a short, low sound like a cough that enjoyed itself. My mother didn't stop him. I felt the moment land, not sharp, not sudden, just clean, just final. The glass in my hand was cool, half full, steady. No one noticed my grip tighten. No one saw me blink twice, slow, deliberate. They thought I was embarrassed, or maybe too disciplined to rise to it. They thought I was still under their thumb. They didn't know I was the thumb. I sipped the wine and set it down gently on the coaster my mother had crocheted years ago, before she stopped making things by hand. The room smelled of aftershave and dust. My old piano still stood in the corner, untuned. My father leaned back in his chair. "Don't take it personally, sweetheart. He's joking." Greg laughed. "Of course I'm joking. She's the best rule follower we have. Wouldn't risk her security clearance, right?" That was when the room tipped. Just a little. Because he was wrong. About what I would risk. About what I had already done. My mother reached forward, adjusting a bowl of nuts that didn't need adjusting. "Well," she said, "Lena's always been the steady one." I looked at her then. The room softened behind her, the light on the brass lamp caught in the lenses of her reading glasses. She looked small, not fragile, but minimized. She didn't know. Or maybe she did and pretended not to. I could never tell with her. She sighed. "Just don't get caught in the middle of this, sweetheart." I nodded. Greg had moved on to something else. A story about one of his old partners, a yacht, a customs issue that somehow turned into a punchline. I listened, not to the story, to the gaps between it. He was nervous. His rhythm was off. He laughed too loud at his own lines. He kept glancing at his phone on the coffee table, checking for something. Maybe the ruling. Maybe a message from the journalist he'd leaked to. Maybe something else. I let him talk. I let them all talk. And when the conversation drifted into politics, then weather, then neighborhood gossip, I stood and gathered empty glasses without being asked. Habit. That's what they called it. Invisibility by arrangement, by design. Later, in the guest room, I sat on the edge of the bed. I didn't turn on the light. I looked out through the window at the backyard, dark, overgrown, unremarkable. The apple tree was still there. The swing was gone. My phone buzzed once, a name I didn't recognize, a one-line message. Defense team filed the motion. Claims emotional conflict and improper evidence handling. You're named. I sat very still. Then I read it again. You're named. They had made me a target of the defense, which meant the court would have to examine my involvement, which meant the court would have to read the file, which meant someone in that courtroom would finally say the code name out loud, RAVENWATCH. I stood, opened my suitcase, and pulled out the sealed envelope I'd kept tucked into the lining. It was heavier than paper should be, denser. Inside, the affidavit. My affidavit. 212 pages of signed, time-stamped, encrypted documentation, chain of custody logs, metadata trails, financial summaries, all admissible, all unshakable. I placed it on the desk. The hotel room was silent except for the buzz of the mini fridge. I stared at the wall for a long time. Then I sat, and I began to read. I sat alone in my hotel room, blinds half closed, city light bleeding through in quiet strips. The affidavit lay open on the desk. The paper looked ordinary. Nothing on the surface hinted at what it could do. I didn't read to remember. I read to calibrate, to hold the line straight. Line 47, evidence log dated and notarized. Greg's alias in a supplier network flagged by a NATO partner. Line 72, encrypted correspondence routed through a dummy server registered in Nevada, then traced to a laptop on his dining table. Line 109, a backdoor protocol embedded in firmware tagged for overseas defense contractors. Origin, his codebase. None of this was guesswork. None of it was interpretation. It was fact. I had buried the hours into this case. Days of combing packet loss data, nights parsing checksum failures that made no sense until they did, entire weekends building timelines, collapsing version histories, matching anomalies to names, and always, always returning to him. He wasn't just careless. He was confident, and he was about to learn the difference. I closed the file. My badge sat on the dresser beside my keys, dull under the lamplight. My jacket hung from the back of the chair, the nameplate visible. I reached out and turned it around. No one needed to see it tonight. There was no anger, not anymore. It had burned off like fog. What remained was clarity, precision, focus. The kind the military teaches you when orders are incomplete, when allies are unsure, when everything depends on staying clean, staying still, staying exact. I wasn't sleeping much these days. That wasn't new. I made tea and sat on the carpet, cross-legged, back straight. I'd been taught to hold still, even in pain. The body learns what it's told. On the nightstand, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was the case manager. The motion had gone to the judge's chamber. Review had been expedited. My presence had been requested, not as a party to the case, but as an expert witness. Anonymous no more. They were naming me. The judge wanted RAVENWATCH. I looked at the clock. 3:17. I didn't hesitate. I stood, pulled my jacket from the chair, and buttoned it slowly. My movements were automatic. Muscle memory over emotion. I opened the hotel safe and took out the sealed drive. Red label, BioLock. Inside, every segment of the case's root architecture, cloned and authenticated. I placed it next to the affidavit. 2 artifacts. That's what they were. Not stories, not arguments, just data. By morning, the court would have both. Not because I wanted revenge, because the truth had reached its moment. Not louder, just closer. The sun rose without asking permission. I showered, pulled my hair back, and stood in front of the mirror. No makeup, no ornament, Just the uniform, clean and correct. I didn't feel brave. I felt ready. At 6 o'clock, I called the court's administrative liaison, confirmed delivery protocols, scheduled drop-off, affirmed confidentiality chain of custody. They asked if I needed security. I said no. That was still true. At 7:10, I walked out of the hotel and into the gray morning. My steps were even. No music, no distractions. Just the weight of the affidavit in my left hand and the drive in my right. 2 blocks from the courthouse, I passed a coffee cart. I nodded at the vendor. He saluted. Not because he knew me, because he knew what I wore. At the courthouse entrance, the marshal checked my ID, then paused. "You're the one they called?" he asked. I nodded once. His tone changed. "Judge Mendel doesn't call many people in person." "I know," I said. They led me to a quiet room on the 3rd floor. No windows, just a table and 2 chairs. The court tech entered 5 minutes later, gloves on, chain of custody log in hand. We didn't speak much. He knew his job. I handed him the affidavit, logged the time, then placed the drive on the table. "Password?" he asked. "Doesn't use one," I replied. He raised an eyebrow. "Biometric?" He nodded. I placed my hand on the scanner. The drive blinked once, then opened. "Contents," he said. "Evidence package. Labeled per the master file, sequential." He began the check. Behind us, the door opened. A court officer stepped in. Quiet, neutral. "The judge would like to speak with you." I didn't ask why. I followed. The hallway was long, carpeted in maroon and brown. We passed portraits of men who believed history came with gavel and seal. None of them wore uniforms. The officer opened the door. Inside, walnut panels, clean lines, morning light angled through narrow glass. Judge Mendel sat at the head of the chamber. No robe, just a dark gray suit and a small stack of folders. He looked up. "Lieutenant Carter," he said. I stopped. He said it again, lower this time. "The Lieutenant Carter." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Because names, when earned, don't need volume. They just need to be true. Judge Mendel didn't ask me to sit. He didn't offer coffee or make polite remarks about my record. He simply looked at me for a long moment, then opened the folder in front of him. I remained standing. He skimmed the first few pages. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, not quite surprise. "This is precise," he said, tapping the affidavit once with his index finger. "You built this like a structure meant to outlast a storm." I didn't answer. He kept reading. When he reached the section with the procurement logs, he leaned back. "They filed a motion to dismiss based on emotional bias," he said finally. "Conflict of interest, claiming the investigation was compromised due to family involvement." I nodded once. I recused myself as soon as his name surfaced in the metadata. "You didn't tell them?" "No." "Why?" I paused. "Because silence is a form of structure, too." The judge studied me. "You know they'll tear into your credibility," he said. "Not in court, in media. The defense already leaked part of the motion. You'll be the angry sister with a badge. The narrative's cheap, but it works." "I know," I said. He closed the file. "And you don't care?" "I care enough to do it anyway." He nodded slowly. "The system's never quite ready for people who use it correctly." Then he stood, thanked me, and said nothing else. I left the courthouse the way I entered, quietly without ceremony. Outside, the light had sharpened. A row of gray clouds pressed low against the skyline. I walked 2 blocks, turned left, and entered the parking garage. I drove back to the hotel. The valet didn't look up. In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and unzipped my jacket, folded it, placed it back in the garment bag. I hung the bag in the closet, then stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door. I could still hear Greg's voice in my head, casual, joking, invincible. "Maybe you can grab coffee for my legal team." My phone buzzed once. A new message. "Clerk just confirmed. Motion to dismiss scheduled for 9 a.m. Your presence is required. They'll call you as a witness. No emotion, just fact." I closed the message, set the phone down, and began to prepare. Not emotionally, tactically. Greg's lawyers were going to try to discredit the case by discrediting me. They would point to the surname, the holidays, the shared childhood. They would imply bias, maybe even vendetta. They didn't know I had built a wall between myself and the case so strong it could be audited in court. Every action, every keystroke, every access point was documented. I hadn't touched the prosecution directly, but I had created the blueprint. The case file was a house. I wasn't the one living in it. I was the architect, and that distinction mattered. My laptop glowed in the dim room. I opened the master index and reviewed the briefing one last time. I didn't flinch when I saw his name. Not this time. Gregory Carter, alias G. Lane. Registered shell corporations, 9. Flagged contracts, 4. Violation markers, 16. My job wasn't to punish. That wasn't my jurisdiction. My job was to reveal. I slept 3 hours, dreamless, flat. At dawn, I dressed again. Not the same uniform, this one was darker. Full insignia, high collar, every detail exact. In the mirror, I didn't look severe, just finished. By the time I reached the courthouse, the press had arrived. Not many, just enough to matter. I walked through them without comment. My heels echoed on the steps. In the security line, a woman whispered, "That's his sister." I kept walking. Inside, the courtroom was cold, not in temperature, in tone. His lawyers were already there, suits too sharp, expressions too smooth. They saw me and smirked. I didn't return it. Greg sat at the defense table, hair trimmed, tie neat, eyes tired. He didn't look at me. He didn't look anywhere. Judge Mendel entered. "Call the witness." The bailiff's voice was calm. "Lieutenant Lena Carter." I stood, walked forward, took the oath, sat. The defense began. They tried to rattle me with questions that sounded casual but weren't. "Lieutenant Carter, you're the defendant's sister, correct?" "Yes." "You investigated your own family member?" I flagged anomalous behavior during a standard audit. At that time, the data was anonymized, but you knew it was him eventually. When the data matched an ID from a procurement registry, I reported the conflict and recused myself. But you built the case. I built the protocol. He leaned forward. "Do you think your personal feelings influenced this?" "No." He smiled like he'd won something. Then he opened a folder and pulled out an old photograph. "Can you confirm this is you and your brother from a family holiday?" "Yes." "Where was this taken?" "Rockbridge." He tried to twist it, tried to draw a line between proximity and compromise. But I had spent months erasing that line, brick by brick. "Lieutenant," he said, voice rising a fraction, "you're asking us to believe that despite your close relationship, you could separate your emotions from your judgment?" "I'm not asking," I replied. "I'm demonstrating." The courtroom was still. Then the judge leaned forward. "Enough," he said. "Submit your motion, counselor." The defense attorney hesitated. "Now." He submitted. The judge read silently for 2 minutes, then looked at Greg. Motion denied, bail denied, defendant remanded. The words landed like quiet thunder. The marshals moved, cuffs clicked. Greg didn't speak, didn't struggle. He turned once. His eyes found mine. And for the first time, he didn't smirk. When I left the courthouse, the sky had gone pale with winter light. No sun, just brightness without warmth, the kind that makes everything visible, but nothing kind. I didn't speak to the press. I walked past them, past the cluster of onlookers, past the woman in a tan coat who whispered, "That's her." I got in the car and drove. The roads were clear. My hands stayed steady on the wheel. I didn't go back to the hotel. I went to my office. It sat beneath a federal building downtown, a floor that didn't show up on maps, accessed by badge, code, and fingerprint. I stepped through 3 layers of security before the hallway opened. Low ceilings, no windows, just the hum of machines and the rhythm of people who worked in silence. Inside my cube, the lights came on automatically. I sat down, breathed once, opened my laptop. The network came alive. Secure channel, isolated node. I typed my credentials, pressed my hand to the sensor, and waited. The screen unlocked. I pulled up the file labeled RM-023, RAVENWATCH. It was closed now, officially. The arrest had finalized it. The handoff was done. My involvement on paper was over. But the aftermath had begun, because Greg's attorneys had filed a second motion, new grounds, that my presence at the hearing had tainted the process, that the investigation itself was built on bias, and thus all related evidence was fruit from a poisoned tree. I'd expected it. They were trying to suppress the file entirely, not redact, suppress. That's when the judge issued the summons. Not to me, to the case. RAVENWATCH was being called as precedent. They couldn't erase it. Now they had to reckon with it. The prosecutor's office called me that afternoon. Not formally, not with paperwork, just a voice I knew, measured and calm. "We need you to submit a response," she said. "Not as a family member, not as a witness, as author of the protocol, as precedent." "I'm not attached anymore." "It's not attachment," she said, "it's authorship." I said nothing. "You have standing now." I let the silence stretch until it became something solid. Then I said, "Understood." She didn't thank me. She didn't need to. 2 hours later, I was back in front of my laptop. I opened a blank file. The cursor blinked in the upper left corner, waiting. I began to write. RAVENWATCH, Foundation Memo for Evidentiary Framework. Author, Lieutenant Lena Carter, Clearance Level, Tier 4. B Reference Code, AEC-17-USC-. Chapter 4, I started with intent, then methodology. Then the audit trail, how each node was identified, how the anomalies first surfaced, how I built the flags from scratch. Not algorithms, not guesswork, systems, logarithmic ratios based on known deviations in encrypted firmware procurement. I included screenshots, logs, internal memos, not emotional, not reactive, just clean, just exact. By midnight, it was 198 pages. I ran it through the scrubber, pulled identifying markers, layered legal headers, attached the hash certificate. At 0027, I uploaded it to the prosecutor's server. 2-step verification, final passcode from my phone, sent. 30 seconds later, a response pinged, received, timestamp validated. I sat back. The office was quiet, just the low whir of servers behind the wall. I could have left, could have gone back to the hotel or the base or anywhere else, but I didn't. I stayed. I opened the original RAVENWATCH logs, the ones I hadn't needed to touch in weeks. I clicked through them slowly, one by one, watched the old entries open, Greg's email header from 7 months ago, his confirmation code to the dummy server, his payment to the broker in Seoul. Each file still had my initials at the bottom, not because I needed credit, because I needed it to hold. At 1:14, my direct line rang, not the front desk, not my cell, my direct line. I answered. Lieutenant Carter. A pause. Then, Judge Mendel requests a sealed briefing at 0800. You'll be contacted with transport instructions. Understood. Click. No pleasantries. At 3 o'clock, I finally stood, shut down the system, swiped out through the access doors, each one unlocking with the sound of mechanical permission. Outside, the city was empty. A cold wind pushed wrappers along the sidewalk. Streetlights blinked into empty intersections. I walked to my car. As I drove, my phone buzzed again. A number I didn't know. I let it ring. Voicemail. The transcript appeared a minute later. Lena. It's Mom. Your father's upset. We didn't know it would go this far. Call us. Please. I stared at the screen, then turned it face down. Back at the hotel, I showered. Not because I was dirty, because it was the only place no one could ask anything of me. I stood under the water until the pressure changed, until my skin went numb. Then I stepped out, dried off, Sat on the floor beside the bed. I didn't cry, I didn't write, I didn't plan, I just sat. The silence felt earned, not like peace, like ground finally cleared. The courtroom looked different the second time, not physically. The wood was still polished. The seal still hung centered above the bench. The bailiffs stood the same way they always did, hands behind backs, feet shoulder width. But the air had changed, or maybe I had. I arrived at 7:58, wearing the uniform, not out of defiance, not out of pride, because I wanted them to remember what the case had cost, because I wanted no one to mistake me for anything but what I was, a soldier who kept her work exact. Greg's attorneys were already seated. The lead, Wells, smiled as I entered. Not kindly, not warmly, just the thin, rehearsed smile of someone who believes the outcome is already in his favor. He leaned over and whispered something to his colleague. They laughed, soft and short, the kind of laughter lawyers use when they think a woman in uniform is still just a woman first. Judge Mendel entered. No robe again. He sat like the bench belonged to him, not because he claimed it, but because he understood the weight of being still. Let's proceed. Wells rose. Your Honor, as previously filed, we believe the investigation into Mr. Carter's actions was biased from inception. Lieutenant Carter's presence and authorship of the primary evidentiary protocol constitutes a conflict of interest that compromises the integrity of the entire case. He said it like a mantra, words rehearsed in front of mirrors. He gestured toward me, then toward the file marked RAVENWATCH on the table. Furthermore, he continued, we find it extraordinary that the same officer who initiated the digital trail is now being cited as precedent. This is not an investigation, it is a vendetta. Judge Mendel said nothing, just turned to me. Lieutenant Carter. I stood. Sir, you are not required to testify today. You are not under cross-examination. You are here solely to clarify the technical and procedural foundation of RAVENWATCH. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor. You may proceed. I stepped forward, opened the file. The protocol was initiated under Directive 6-19B of the Cybersecurity Export Control Act. The anomalies were detected through an anonymized behavioral index, not a name search. I had no knowledge of the target identity until 2 months into the inquiry. Upon discovery, I filed a conflict of interest disclosure and was recused from direct investigation. My role ceased to be operative and became procedural. Wells cut in. And yet, Lieutenant, your fingerprints are on every page of the process. No, counsel, I said calmly. My structure is. The process ran itself. He stepped forward, voice louder now. Is it not true that your file design directly led to your brother's identification? Yes, and to 4 other prosecutions, 2 international sanctions, and 1 congressional briefing. His mouth opened, then closed. Judge Mendel raised a hand. Enough, counsel. Wells tried to recover. Your Honor, this entire process has been compromised by emotion. The judge looked at him. Emotion? Yes, Your Honor. This is a family matter, not a federal case. Silence. Then Judge Mendel reached for the file, flipped to a page midway through, tapped it once. This footnote, he said, almost conversational, is that the server address that tied procurement activity to a North Korean defense firm? Wells blinked. I'd have to review. You don't need to, the judge said. I have. Then he turned toward the gallery. My father sat in the second row. Hands folded, face blank, as if still waiting for someone to tell him what it meant. My mother beside him, pale, her jaw tight, a paper program crumpled in her hand. Judge Mendel looked back at me. Lieutenant Carter, he said quietly, you may return to your seat. You've clarified what you needed to. I nodded once. Saturday. The judge folded his hands. This court finds the defense's motion to suppress on grounds of personal bias to be unfounded. The structure of RAVENWATCH is intact, admissible, and precedential. There is no indication of procedural failure. Motion denied. Wells didn't move. Bail conditions are revoked. The defendant will be remanded to federal custody until trial. Greg didn't react. Not visibly, but I saw the way his jaw shifted, the micro-muscle twitch behind his left eye, the way his spine lost 1 inch of height. He looked up, met my gaze. I didn't nod. I didn't look away. The marshals approached. The cuffs were silent. Greg stood. He didn't resist, but he looked at our parents. My father shifted, almost stood, then stopped. My mother sighed. Just once. The same way she always had when something turned out worse than expected, but not surprising. As Greg was led out, Wells turned toward me. His voice was lower now. No performance, just calculation. "You didn't win," he said. "You just stripped the wires." I looked at him. That's what systems do when overloaded. They trip breakers to stop the fire. He stared at me, uncertain if it was metaphor. I didn't explain. Outside, the press was waiting again. They saw Greg first. Cameras flashed. Then they saw me. I didn't stop, didn't wave. I walked down the courthouse steps alone. No one followed. That was the part no one ever mentioned. When the machine finally does what it's designed to do, it's not dramatic. It's just done. The next morning, my name was in the briefings, not just the case file. My name, Carter, L., source analyst, protocol author, technical affiant. Status, active duty, task force clearance tier 4, B. No press, no photographs. Just a line in a sealed packet that passed through 3 desks, 2 encrypted networks, and 1 unmarked drop at a field office in Virginia. That was how recognition worked here. No claps, no applause, just access. I sat at the long table, hands folded, while junior officers read my notes aloud to each other. They didn't know I was listening. I didn't correct them. I didn't offer advice. They were doing fine. The newest one, Garcia, stumbled over an acronym and then recovered. He reminded me of myself 4 years ago, all sharpness and silence, desperate to get it right without being noticed. Afterward, I returned to my desk. My inbox had filled, some of it routine, protocol updates, security reminders, a note about a facility inspection. One message stood out. From Commander Whitaker. Subject promotion confirmed. Effective immediately message. Captain Carter, report to Task Group 7E on Monday. Welcome back. No ceremony. No speech. Just rank. I stared at it for a moment, then closed the message. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like being trusted to carry more weight. That afternoon, I packed up my things from the old desk. 2 folders, a pen I liked, my thermos, and a single photo. Not of my family. Not of Greg. It was from my first deployment. I was sitting on a shipping crate, rain jacket soaked, boots in ankle-deep water. The caption had been added later by someone else in Sharpie. Still here. That was all it ever meant. Still here. I moved into the new office without help. No one offered. That was fine. The walls were bare, a single monitor, 2 chairs, 1 locked drawer I hadn't decided how to use. I placed the photo on the corner of the desk and left it facing the wall. By Friday, the RAVENWATCH protocol had been added to the formal training module. They gave it a new name, something longer, duller, easier to fit into PowerPoint slides. I was assigned to brief the next cohort. In the lecture room, 20 new officers sat straight-backed, notepads open. Some tried not to look nervous. I stood at the front, clicked the remote. The first slide appeared. Case Study 7E, Export Integrity Breach and Protocol Evolution. I didn't say my name. I didn't tell them who built it. I just began. This protocol traces its origin to a compromised procurement system, flagged by anomaly detection on a non-critical subnet. What you'll see today is not a story about exposure. It's a study in patience. They listened. They took notes. One asked a question about recursive routing through layered vendor contracts. I nodded, asked him to repeat the question, slower. He did. I walked them through the structure. It was enough. Afterward, I stayed behind to clean the board. Garcia lingered. He looked younger outside the cube. "Ma'am," he said, voice tight, "is it true that you're the one who—" He stopped. I didn't answer. Instead, I picked up my thermos, capped it, and said, "Just do the work. Let it stand." He nodded, backed out of the room. The door closed behind him. I stood in the silence a little longer. Later that week, I passed the courthouse on my way to the metro. I didn't look at it. Buildings like that don't mean anything once the inside work is done. They're just containers. But I did see the bench across the street. That was where I'd waited for the judge's clerk, hours before the first hearing. It was empty now. I sat. Not long. Just enough. Behind me, traffic passed. A child asked for gum. A woman on the phone laughed too hard at something no one else could hear. Normal. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the envelope I hadn't opened. Postmarked 2 days ago. My mother's handwriting. No return address. Inside, a single card. Blank on the front. On the back, one line in her careful script. "We didn't know. We thought it was just your job. There was no signature." I folded the card, put it back in the envelope, tucked it into the inside pocket. I wasn't angry. I wasn't moved. It just didn't change anything. At the task force office, I logged back in. The new case queue was waiting. 6 entries flagged red, 1 marked urgent. Flagged crypto trace originating from a former DoD vendor in Southeast Texas. I opened it, began to read. There was no ending, just the next thing. And the thing after that, still here. They never said the word sorry, not in person, not in writing, not in any way that cost them pride. After the verdict was read, after the cuffs clicked and the doors closed behind Greg, there was nothing. No message, no call, no confrontation, just silence. It held for 2 weeks. Then came the envelope. White, standard. No return address, but the handwriting was my mother's. Inside, a folded sheet of lined paper. At the top, the date. At the bottom, no signature. In between, we didn't expect it to go that far. We were surprised. We thought you would step back, that you would know when enough was enough. He's still your brother. I read it once, then again. There was no mention of what he'd done, no recognition that federal charges weren't a misunderstanding, no question about the facts, just discomfort, just distance. I folded the paper back along its creases and placed it in the drawer beside my desk, not as a keepsake, as a record. It joined the others. My apartment was clean, ordered, sparse. The kind of space where nothing pressed in. Mornings were slow, structured. Steel thermos, 1 sugar, no cream. I ran before sunrise, 12 laps around the perimeter of Fort Rowley. No music, just breath and gravel. Some days I passed younger recruits. They ran faster, less steady. I let them. In the evenings, I taught. Not officially, just those who stayed behind after drills, asking questions no one else would answer. Not about combat, about structure, about discipline, about control. They didn't know about Greg. They didn't ask. They just listened. A few months after the trial, I received a formal request from the Office of Legal Affairs. Would I consent to a case study interview? They were preparing a training module on procedural objectivity and ethics in sensitive investigations. I said yes, not because I wanted the recognition, because someone had to explain what it meant to stay still under pressure. The interview was conducted in a secure room, 2 attorneys, 1 recording device, no cameras. They asked me to recount how I had separated duty from family, how I had drawn the line, how I had known where it was. I told them it was never a line. It was a standard. They wrote it down. Afterward, I walked out alone. The hallway was quiet. On the wall, a plaque honoring analysts lost in classified operations. No names, just dates and the outline of a compass. I paused, touched the glass, not for grief, for reminder. Outside, the sky was gray, cold wind against my face. Winter in the capital settles low, not sharp, just dense. A heaviness that softens sound. I liked it better that way. At home, I checked the mail. A holiday card from my cousin, a catalog I didn't order, a forwarded letter from a financial institution I didn't recognize. Inside, notification of a closed trust. Beneficiary, Lena Carter. Issuer, undisclosed. At the bottom, a printed note. Transfer completed. Per instructions on file, no family notifications made. I stared at it. Not because I didn't understand, because I did. Greg had assets hidden from the case. Someone had folded. Someone had dealt. Someone had preserved a portion, buried under layers of legal ambiguity. Now it was mine. Not by favor, not by request, by default. I placed the letter in the drawer beside the others. Didn't mention it. Didn't use it. The next week, I received a call from a former colleague, someone I'd trained years ago when the protocol was still being shaped. "You were right," he said, "about quiet systems. They hold." I said nothing. He added, "They're teaching your structure at the academy now. It's part of the required coursework." "Good," I said, "no more." The call ended. That night, I walked to the edge of the city, past the last metro stop, past the new developments with their glass balconies and curated landscaping. I stopped near the overlook above the river, watched the water move. No drama, no flood, just current. Behind me, a couple took a photo. A car passed. A dog barked twice, then went quiet. I stood there until the wind changed. Then I turned and walked back. If you've ever been dismissed by the ones who raised you, if you've ever sat at a table where your silence was mistaken for weakness, know this: stillness is not surrender. It's observation. You don't have to raise your voice to be heard. You don't have to explain your worth to people who already decided it's conditional. You don't have to prove anything when the work is done right, in full and on time. Let them laugh. Let them sigh. Let them think you were never really there. And when the moment comes, you'll stand. Not to fight, not to plead, just to confirm what you already knew. One day, someone will whisper your name in a room where no one expected it, and the silence that follows, it will be enough. If this story touched something quiet in you, tell me what stayed behind. And if you'd like to read more, you're welcome to stay. No pressure, just presence.